Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and I think this is a perfect opportunity because you see there is a channel that I already like very much called Leonidas Sparta. As I said already in a previous upload, fantastic channel, link in the description, check him out. And he made a response video to me, which is this one here. Now we're gonna check out a couple of clips from this video, but in reality what I'm doing here is not necessarily a debate. I don't even disagree with him on this topic, as I know, because we have talked a little bit in the comments. But the reason why I'm making this response video is because it's a fantastic opportunity to talk about something absolutely fascinating. Two topics that I love to bits. Late Bronze Age cavalry, whether it existed or not, spoiler alert it did, and the Trojan War and its historicity. So massive thanks to Leonidas Sparta for this opportunity, and let's jump right into it.
This one's going to be interesting. Metatron versus Dr. Ditch himself. I was quite excited to see that he finally brought Roll Kneidike up. A good friend of mine and a friend of the channel, you've seen him before.
Excellent historian.
However, I was a little bit surprised when I saw the title of the video, which was that he does not agree with him. And I thought, knowing Roll personally and just genuinely knowing how well versed of a historian he is, I was not expecting at all to see a video where Metatron disagreed with him. So I watched the video with an open mind, and I love Metatron as a YouTuber, one of my favourites. I'm actually a channel member of his.
I confirm that.
It's by no means an attack on Metatron at all, but if I'm being quite honest, I generally really love how pedantic Metatron is. I think that he was a little bit too pedantic in this case and often disagreed.
There is no such a thing.
With Roll a little bit unnecessarily. I'm not trying to accuse him of anything. It felt like he was maybe disagreeing sort of for the sake of it. I'm not trying to speak for what he did, it's just sort of how I felt when I watched the video, which usually I really...
Absolutely valid point of criticism.
Maybe it's my personal bias coming in because, again, I know Roll quite well. There were just sort of a few sections where I was like, I think you're just misunderstanding what Roll's saying here. Sort of one section that I want to touch on, which is a little bit more of my area, well, in this case Bronze Age, but an ancient Greek sort of topic about cavalry.
Freaking love your setup, by the way. The map and the helmet, top notch. Anyways, we are talking about, as you can see, the usage of cavalry in the sense of mounted warriors. There is a reason why I'm specifying this, we'll see that later, but we're talking about the usage of cavalry within armies during the late Bronze Age. You know me, if I think that I said something incorrectly, and I do think there is one thing that I did say incorrectly in that video, and I will admit that publicly today, if I do think that I say something incorrectly and someone who is making either a response video, a debunking video, a correction video about something I said, I will admit it, no problem, but if I think I'm right, I'll double down, and I did double down on the testudo, which was one of the two areas of disagreement between me and the statements made by the professor. Link in the description below. But now let's focus on this section about cavalry. Was I wrong or not?
Which is his mention about cavalry in the movie Troy.
In the period where this poem is set, there was no mounted cavalry. And even in later periods, you rarely have people actually fighting on horseback. It's hard to work out how to use cavalry tactically. It's difficult to use it if you don't have very many of them. And horses are just very precious. It costs an enormous amount of money to maintain a horse, so you don't want to waste your horse on something like...
When he says in this period, I wonder what he means exactly, because I mean, Macedonian cavalry is a thing.
This is sort of where I wanted to touch on. I think it's quite clear that he is specifically talking about the late Bronze Age, the time of the Trojan War, the time of Homer's Iliad, which takes place around 1200 BC.
Debated. I'll give you the two possible dates as historians are still discussing on that.
So close to 1,000 years before Macedonian cavalry takes place, and he's absolutely correct in this instance. So in that sense, we don't really see mounted cavalrymen. We do see charioteers.
Okay, before we go into his explanation of the charioteers, which is really well made, I do want to kind of defend my position here. What did I mean and why did I disagree? To further dissect the statement from the historian.
In the period where this poem is set, there was no mounted cavalry.
Already this, I disagree. In this specific period, late Bronze Age, there was mounted cavalry, and most likely there may have been mounted cavalry specifically in the context of the Trojan War, not with the Mycenaeans, but with the Trojans. So yes, that's why I found that statement strange, because if you look at, for instance, the Hittite army composition, which we will discuss today, they 100% used mounted cavalry, and they are from specifically this period, which is why I was asking, I wonder what he means with this period in connection with there is no cavalry. That was my question, really, because when you just say in this period there is no mounted cavalry, then I will disagree, because in this period there is mounted cavalry, and there most likely was during this specific war. I'll justify this with the sources in a moment. However, as I always give the benefit of the doubt to any intellectual opponent, if he actually meant that there was no cavalry only with the Mycenaeans, then sure, they would have fielded chariots. But on top of that, listen to this.
And even in later periods, you
Even in later periods,
rarely have people actually fighting on.
you rarely have people actually fighting on horse. He said later periods, which is why I mentioned then the Macedonian cavalry. Of course, I know that the Macedonian cavalry didn't occur in the 12th century or in the late Bronze Age like here, but he did say in later periods. So this is why I was a little puzzled, and then you yourselves, Leonidas, Sparta, tell me, oh, but that happens 1,000 years after. Oh, yes, but he did say later periods. So that's just to give you context as to why I even mentioned the Macedonian cavalry and why I disagreed with the statement that there was no cavalry in this period. They're both very clear statements, because I know that the historian is really good and very versed. I say, I wonder what he actually meant by this period then, because the two statements taken outside and examined are both incorrect, unless by later period he meant, well, I don't know, what did he mean? Because, yeah, Alexander the Great occurs in a later period. But the Alexander the Great and the Macedonian cavalry, and this is the part that I do admit fault, probably wasn't the best example that I could have used. The Hittite cavalry is the best example that I could have used, which is what we're going to discuss now. First and foremost, the first attestations when it comes to cavalry used in military operations during the Bronze Age have to do with the Hittite war machine when it comes to the Bronze Age. These are specifically identified as a separate type of mounted unit independent from chariots that are used for all sorts of operations. Sometimes for scouting purposes, sometimes for reconnaissance, other times for messages. But of course these three don't matter for the sort of statements that we're making today. Cavalry is also used, however, as an independent corps for fighting, and most likely tactically employed as its own wings, but also in those contexts where geographically chariots wouldn't be used with the same level of effectiveness, terrain being not the only one but one of the factors. But of course at this point you could ask me the question, but Metatron, here we are talking about Trojans versus Mycenaeans. Why are you talking about the Hittites? We understand that the Hittites are in the same period, but aren't these the two factions we are talking about? After all, there were no Hittites in front of the city of Troy fighting the Mycenaeans. But here is the part that I think is the most interesting. There absolutely is a very strong connection between the Hittite army organization and the Trojan army organization. And I will defend this point, but before we jump into the actual Hittite archives and documents, there are a few we're going to explore, we should first explain this point of connection. And in order to do that, we need to answer the following question. Did the Trojan War actually happen historically? In other words, is Troy a real historical city? Obviously, the Iliad is first and foremost a literary text, a production, an epic, and in fact, somewhat a book of mythology. But it is also a historical book. In fact, if someone were to ask me, is the Iliad about historical events or mythology, the correct answer would be yes. The city of Troy absolutely existed historically, and the conflict did happen. Moreover, the connection is the fact that the historical inhabitants of Troy, which would be the city of Wilusa, were vassals of the Hittites. And even though they were a culturally separated reality, they were technically Luvians, and they lived on the periphery of the Hittite Empire, the Hittite Empire had a very strong influence, both culturally, economically, and militarily, with the city of historical Troy. In the book, The Organization of the Hittite Army, written by Richard Henry Beale, he notes the presence of the term in Akkadian Pithallu, and it is found in the text dedicated to the composition of the Hittite armies in the late Bronze Age. Now, the word Pithallu in subsequent Neo-Assyrian documents from the Iron Age clearly indicates the armored and armed horsemen. However, its meaning in the late Bronze Age Hittite context was debated, with some people interpreting it as just being a mounted messenger or perhaps a light cavalryman, a scout. Now, Beale does not only consider the use of mounted messenger, as other authors do, as a weak explanation, but he specifically claims to identify units with the word pitallu consisting of multiple elements within an original core in the documentation. Now, when it comes to the dating, the correct historical dating of the Trojan War, specifically the Siege of Troy, historians and classicists debated, and we do have two possibilities. Either 1334 BC, proposed by Duris of Samos, or 1170 BC, proposed by Sosibius. The site recognized today that represents the hill sung by Homer is the hill of Isarlik in Turkey. Furthermore, excavations that have been carried out there found some very interesting data when it comes to the archaeological evidence discovered. Now, to defend my position when it comes to the presence of specific military corps of mounted cavalry warriors and horsemen in the context of the Hittite army in the late Bronze Age, we will be reviewing the following data: archaeological goods, literary evidence, and a corpus of documents found in the archives of the city of Hattusha, the capital of the Hittite Empire in Anatolia. And these documents specifically deal with the relationships during the late Bronze Age between the Hittites and a mysterious Western reality known as the Ahiyawa, recognized by scholars as specifically the Mycenaean world. Moreover, it is in these documents that we'll find the final nail on the coffin to corroborate the otherwise single archaeological findings found by archaeologists that help us pinpoint the correct position in time and space of historical Troy, identified as the ancient city of Wilusa. From an archaeological point of view, the site of Homeric Troy, or rather the city that classical scholars have identified with Homeric Troy, is today universally recognized as the hill of Hisarlik in Turkey, excavated between 1870 and 1890 by Heinrich Schliemann. It should be said that the city had gone through alternating phases of abandonment and repopulation, and that at least until the 15th century its location was still widely known, when, according to the Byzantine historian Critobulus, the Sultan of the Ottoman Turks, Mehmed II, went specifically there to the city of Troy to celebrate his conquest of Constantinople 9 years after the fact. Now, what's interesting about the way the text presents the event, which is quite propagandistic, this was considered a just retribution inflicted on the Greek for having devastated this Asian city, Wilusa. The various excavation data that has emerged over the years offer at least two strata that could be associated with Troy. Troy 6, dated from 1700 to 1300 BC, or possibly 1250 BC, and Troy 7a, dated between 1300 to 1250 BC, or possibly 1170 BC. Troy 6 is absolutely fascinating with its imposing bastions and its large settlement layout, which could maintain a population able to compete with that of actual metropolis of the period, and it would be compatible with the majestic description that Homer makes in the Iliad, while Troy 7a presents a very interesting widespread ash layer, which is compatible with a fire, moreover related to a whole series of findings that would suggest and indicate an act of war. As a further reinforcement of our historical identification of Wilusa as the Homeric Troy, not only we have evidence that Troy 7a was destroyed by a malicious military-related fire, but Troy 6 was destroyed by an earthquake. I find it particularly significant that the horse that we often see in conjunction with the siege and the destruction of Troy was indeed also a symbol of Poseidon, the god of the seas, but also a representation of earthquakes. Troy existed, and the war surely happened. The Iliad is not mythology. Regarding the documentary and epigraphic findings related to the Bronze Age strata, unfortunately the evidence we have is fragmentary in nature. Therefore, if we want to find writings that narrate the history of the city, seeking a connection with the Homeric epic, we must look to the ancient Near East. In the archive of Hattusha, today found in Turkey, the capital of the Hittite Empire, which during the late Bronze Age was one of the most influential nations, a corpus of 28 texts has been discovered, from which one can extrapolate the difficult relationship between the Hittites and a Western neighbor presented, as we said, with the name of Ahiyawa. Now, the majority of today's historians are inclined to identify Ahiyawa with the Mycenaean world, Ahaioi being the Achaeans, both from the naming conventions of some of its representatives and for the geographical location which, according to the Hittites, would have been, open quotes, beyond the sea, west of the islands off the Anatolian coast. Close quotes. The first relations between the Hittites and the, we'll now call them Mycenaeans, dates back to 1400 BC, when reference is made of a series of Mycenaean raids against the vassals of the Hittites along the coasts of the Anatolian peninsula, and in the island of Cyprus, which were carried out by someone named Atarsia. Now, this so-called Atarsia, or Atarsia, would have arrived in Anatolia with an imposing army, and possibly 100 war chariots. And for the name, a parallel has been proposed with the Mycenaean form of the name of Atreus, the founder of Mycenae and father of Agamemnon and Menelaus, according to the myth. Furthermore, according to specialists, meaning Hittitologists, I can never pronounce that word right, this name in this language is in adjectival form, and the translation would be of Atreus. It's a possessive adjective, interestingly enough, utilized in the exact same way as the Iliad uses the term to define both Agamemnon and Menelaus, of Atreus. If Atarsia's imposing army with its hundreds of war chariots could hardly have been deployed by a single Mycenaean realm, it could be compatible with an alliance formed by different Mycenaean kingdoms, and the connection immediately runs to the catalogue that we find of ships manned by Mycenaeans mentioned in the Iliad. Now, for deeper context, simultaneous with Atarsia's expeditions in Anatolia, we can suppose that the Mycenaeans would also have cultivated excellent relationships with the so-called League of Assuwa, a confederation formed extemporaneously among 22 city-states and small kingdoms of western Anatolia, precisely to stem Hittite imperial expansion. And here is the part that is the most interesting to me. From Hittite contemporary documentations, we know that a king of Ahiyawa, so Mycenaeans, had given his daughter in marriage to a king of the Assuwa League. And moreover, during excavation at Hattusha in 1991, a sword was discovered consecrated by the Hittite king to celebrate his victory over Assuwa, the League, and this is evidently of Mycenaean workmanship. From this moment on, the Mycenaean world would be a destabilizing element regarding the Western Anatolian scenario, functioning as an anti-Hittite force to try to find its own personal space in the Anatolian chessboard. Now, why am I mentioning these 22 cities that belonged to Western Anatolia and this specific anti-Hittite league? Because two of these could be easily connected to cities that are mentioned in Homer's Iliad. According to the linguist Paul Kretschmer, the first to formulate this hypothesis, one of these city-states would be connected to the Ilios sung by Homer, which originally, according to the metric analysis, would have had a name that began with the letter gamma, and instead the city-state of Tarquisa will also find its counterpart in the region of the Troad. The geographical coordinates that can be derived from the Hittite document CTH191 show how the location of Wilusa is largely overlapping with that of Troy excavated by Schliemann. But even though, and this is critical here, initially Wilusa had joined the Assuwa League in an anti-Hittite function, it will subsequently leave it and become a faithful vassal of the Hittite Empire. This is the beginning of the connection between Troy and the Hittite world. So much so that when in 1300 BC a new league of Luwian populations will form to oppose the Hittites once again, in this case Wilusa will not take part and will remain uninvolved. The Mycenaeans at this time will play a crucial role in these wars, supporting rebels coming to directly occupy the Anatolian city of Milawata, or Miletus, in which precisely in this period we have in fact a condensing, we could say, of Mycenaean material in the archaeological record. The Mycenaean world throughout 1400 BC exerts a heavy political and cultural influence on coastal Anatolia. This is proven in the excavation of Hattusha, where a ceramic fragment emerged showing the depiction of a warrior who is evidently Mycenaean, and this, connected with the sword dedicated to the storm god, leads one to consider that within the armies of the Luwian rebels, we had either Mycenaean mercenaries or that they had access to some of their equipment. During the 13th century BC, the relationships between the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaeans worsen. We are told about a Mycenaean champion, written in the Hittite records with the name Pia Maradu, which linguists have identified as a transliteration of the Greek name Priam. We are told that in the 13th century BC, Pia Maradu, or Priam, occupies the city of Wilusa, or Troy, and this forced the Hittite king to send an army to reconquer it. Wilusa is cited as the cause of great friction between the king of the Hittites and the king of the Mycenaeans. As described in document CTH-74, the Hittite king manages to reconquer the city of Troy, which now was in Mycenaean hands, and as he does that, he re-established the previous monarch and reinstalls them, or reinstitute their vassalage. This is curiously known as the Treaty of Alexandru, which was the name of the Trojan king. At least the aristocrats in Wilusa could have even been of partial Mycenaean origin due to the name, but I won't dive into that too deeply, as here we are mostly interested in the military. All of the events that I've just described, coming from both the archaeological record and all of the corpus of documents that come from these excavations in Hattusha, occurred over a span of 150 years, and it's extremely likely that this was the origin or the foundation of the Trojan War described in the Iliad. I in fact wish to state that the events concerning the relationships between the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, and the Luvians contributed to developing the framework within which Homer, or whoever for him, created the Iliad. Now, for full context, do keep in mind that this is only one of the two areas in which I disagreed with the expert historian, the other one being the part where he talked about the testudo, and I did double down on that one with this dedicated video. So the historian made some statements when it comes to the Roman testudo, I disagreed, and then I made a in-depth analysis of the tactical usages of the Roman testudo to justify my disagreement. Having established the sort of very strong connection of vassalage and military cooperation that you had between the Hittite Empire and historical Troy, let's now discuss the organizational aspects of the military machine of the Hittites, and you will see that they did indeed, in this specific period, field cavalry. In its early iteration, the Hittite army was composed of the following type of forces: the permanent army, the reserve, conscripted troops, regional troops, and mercenaries, and finally allied troops. Let's now analyze the different corps and the different arms and the different sections of the army. We have charioteers, cavalry, infantry, archers, light infantry, and runners. For deeper context, let's also quantify the numbers when it comes to Hittite army. Normally, the history of the Hittites is divided into three periods: the Old Kingdom from 1700 to 1500 BC, the Middle Kingdom from 1500 to 1350 BC, and the New Kingdom from 1300 BC to 1178 BC. Already during the Old Kingdom, the Hittites showed great initiative with assaults in Syria and Mesopotamia, causing, for example, the collapse of the kingdom of Yamhad. But during the New Kingdom, the Hittites' radius of influence would increase exponentially, expanding over almost all of Western Anatolia. We could say that they were the direct antagonist of the Egyptians for control over the Levant. Now, when speaking about the army, the sources are not always easy to decipher because we find them in multiple languages and in fact a mixture: Hittite, Sumerian, and Akkadian. And this contributes to the composition of composite words with a very broad semantic range. However, there are three terms that we find overwhelmingly in these documents: the words Erimesh, Karash, and Tuzi. Erimesh is a Sumerian term that can be translated as troops, although sometimes it also has the singular meaning of soldier. Erimesh usually indicates in a general way both infantry troops and charioteers and cavalry troops. However, when we find it in contrast with another Sumerian term, Ansekun Ramesh, in that case Erimesh exclusively indicates infantry troops. So, on its own, it's a general umbrella term, including infantry, cavalry, and chariots. But if it's used in the same sentence or section with the term Enseku Ramesh, which does mean horses, then it only means infantry. Karash is also a Sumerian term that finds its counterpart in the Akkadian Karaju, which means camp, and by extension, army. In Hittite texts, the word Karash appears substantially as a synonym of Erimesh, which we said can mean troops, although sometimes it has a somewhat broader meaning, encompassing not only the troops, the fighting troops, but also the civilian personnel assigned to, for example, logistics that accompany them. Thus, it's the totality of the army. However, once again, when Karash is cited in contrast to Erimesh, it exclusively indicates the civilian component, precisely as opposed to actual combatants. Finally, the word tuzi is a properly Hittite term that derives from the verb tuzia, which means to camp. In Hittite texts, tuzi seems to be substantially a synonym of karash, so the army in its fullness. The interesting fact is that it seems that for the population of the ancient Near East, one of the characteristics and distinctive traits of the army was that of camping and setting up camp. Textual analysis also shows several terms that appear during the Middle Kingdom, which seems to indicate permanent troops. They were not discharged, but wintered in the capital of the empire and were deployed in other localities and provinces during peacetimes, and dealt with actions of gendarmerie or military engineering and civil engineering. These did not constitute the totality of the Hittite army, but were a very well-trained corps. It is incredible to note how socially evolved the Hittite empire must have been at the time. Elite chariot and palace guards are also mentioned among these professional soldiers. They also have another type of soldier, the maceman, literally. These, instead of being paid as salary, received a plot of land as compensation and were part of their reserves that could be mobilized in case of necessity. In other words, they would be very similar to the American National Guard. In the ancient texts, we also find the expression erin mesh narari. This literally means support troops or help troops, and it indicates a levy of conscripts. These were citizens of the Hittite Empire, farmers, shepherds, craftsmen who, in case of need, were conscripted into troops that went to support the professional army. Exactly like the professional army, we know from sources that they went on to constitute both infantry units and mounted units, and to use the period word apiru, which derives from the Akkadian term that originally referred to farmers who had turned to nomadism and then to banditry and mercenary work, a sort of irregular militia, if you will, used by the Hittite army. In Hittite sources, we then have the term shardia, which indicates forces provided by allied kingdoms. Given the war chariot, as indicated cleverly by both Leonidas Sparta and the professor, was central of Bronze Age army, and it was central of the army of the Hittites as well. And in the sources we find it indicated with the terms gish, gigir, and with the term sim, anshekur, ramesh, which means horse squad. The chariots were made of wood and leather, pulled by a pair of horses, and it initially had a crew of 2 individuals. The charioteer, who held the reins and who also carried a shield, and the second, the actual chariot warrior, who fought with bow and arrow. Both the crew and the horses were protected by armor, often scale. This to underline that, at least for the Hittite army, even though the idea of chariots used as a sort of taxi service within the battlefield may have happened, these were combatant units, 100%. Between 1295 and 1272 BC, we witness a sort of military reform. In fact, in the relief of Pharaoh Seti I, we note Hittite war chariots with a crew of 2 individuals, while in the relief of Ramses II, we see that the Hittite chariots now have 3 combatants on them. This third individual is often depicted with a pole weapon. The length has been calculated in a very theoretical and rough way using the depictions on the relief, and has been estimated from 180 to 250 centimeters. It is probable that there were also javelins to be thrown from the chariot, as well as a thrusting lance to keep the enemies at bay. Moreover, among the charioteers we also have a specific elite corps called the gold charioteers, who were probably the king's entourage on the battlefield. The term lupithallui, which indicates in Neo-Assyrian the horseman, is present in Hittite documents. If cavalry was not completely foreign to the Anatolian and Near Eastern world, we must still consider that in the Bronze Age, as correctly explained, it must have had a minor role compared to that of war chariots, and it probably had to be a role relegated to light harassment troops rather than shock cavalry. But it is incorrect to exclude a priori the usage of mounted warriors in this period. That is because when we find the term sekur ramesh, horses, or by extension troops that make usage of horses, most likely, in the majority of cases, the reference is indeed to charioteers. However, along with war chariots, infantry was the other predominant element of the Hittite army. Hittite infantry being equipped mainly with spear and shield, also with a secondary weapon, a mace, an axe, or curved swords, sort of similar to the Egyptian kopesh. The lumesh gish ban, the archers, are mentioned only once in the Hittite force, in a passage that distinguishes them from the charioteers. So these are units of foot archers, and they did exist too. During the New Kingdom, between 1321 and 1295 BC, the term Erish Mesh Suti appears. This means troops that carry out lightning actions. These are mercenary units initially recruited in Syria, which would become the term to indicate, in a generalist manner, the light infantry forces, which operated in conjunction with light cavalry mounted troops, as evidence in the documents. Mounted cavalry, not chariots. chariots. During the Old Kingdom, the infantry troops numbered several thousands, while the charioteers must have been between a few dozens and a few hundred. There is also a military rank that represents the superintendent of 1,000 charioteers, still during the Old Kingdom, a position that came in pairs. 4,000 men, 2,000 chariots, this would be the totality of the Hittite army. Now, during the Middle Kingdom, the empire was able to mobilize a contingent that became 10,000 infantry and hundreds of chariots. And in the Battle of Kadesh, 37,000 infantry and 3,500 war chariots were brought, a total of 47,500 men. That is because we have to remember that at this time already the charioteers had 3 men per chariot. So, as we read the sources, it is evident that there is a distinction made both between chariots and cavalry mounted forces, and we know that these cavalry mounted forces were used tactically in conjunction with light infantry. Considering that we have all of these examples of how the Hittite army did field cavalry units specifically in this period, and how they were using them exactly against the same Mycenaeans that will attack the vassal city of Wilusa, aka Troy, I think it is very probable, considering that Troy was indeed a vassal of the Hittite Empire, and that the Hittite army was subsequently sent to fight the Mycenaeans at Troy to kick them out after the taken of the city. I think it is very probable that the Trojans, being vassals of the Hittite Empire, may have fielded their own cavalry troops against the Mycenaeans and their war chariots. Regardless, I hope that you found all of this information interesting and pertinent, but most importantly, I do want to say thank you to both the professor and Leonidas Sparta for inspiring the production of this video. Thank you very much, all of you, for watching. Please do subscribe to Leonidas Sparta, and thank you for watching, and I will see you tomorrow for my next daily upload. Goodbye. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much.